Hey there, how's it going? Today, I want to be talking about The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This book was the winner for fiction in 2020 on Goodreads, and I saw a lot of people talking about this on my Twitter, so I figured it was finally time for me to sit down and read through this book. And I'm really happy that I did that. Before we get into it, I've got some mild content warnings. This book goes deep on depression and self-harm and suicide, so if you're uncomfortable with any of those things, maybe check out the next book instead. Anyway, The Midnight Library. I wasn't sure what to expect from it. I knew it was fiction, but I guess fiction doesn't mean fantasy, and that's something that I always mess up in my head. So going into this book, I had an expectation that this was going to be similar to what I understand A Starless Sea is. I haven't read that book yet, but I think that that's more the vibe I was ready for, especially when the plot that I understood was when our main character Nora dies, she wakes up to find herself in a library where every book is another life that she can live, and when she reads those books, she dives into them and lives those lives. With that plot description, I felt like this was going to be a more fantastical element-driven story as compared to a character-driven story, and that's just a weird hang-up that I had going into this. My expectations weren't what I should have had them at, and this is more of a It's a Wonderful Life tale than Starless Sea tale, probably. So this is not a real issue with the book, just to be clear. This was just a weird thing that I had, and maybe you might have the same misunderstanding, and I just want to clear that up before you go into reading this book thinking it's going to be one thing and then it's something else, and that might lead to not enjoying it as much as you could have enjoyed it if you knew what you were getting into. But yes, this book follows Nora. We see at the beginning of this book that her life's not doing so great, and in fact, everything that she has an attachment to has detached itself from her as the beginning few chapters go on. And so she's driven further and further into this depression. With no one in sight, with all these bad things happening to her, she ultimately decides that she needs to kill herself. That's how the story begins. We then see her go through different lives, exploring really human ideas of regrets and what ifs and seeking approval from others for your actions, insecurities, the human experience, all bundled up in a very dense package. We see Nora as she explores different lives, as an Olympic swimmer, as a dog walker, as a wife. She's checking in on every what if that led to the hole that she found herself in at the beginning of this book. I'm sure that these emotions that are being portrayed through the themes in this book are pretty universal. Grass is always greener and all that. But I think this book does a really good job at exploring the idea that no matter what decisions you make, no matter what life path you choose, there's going to be hardship. There are going to be mistakes that you make, tragic events that take place, and more importantly, this is the life that you live. You will not just be dropped in another one. And so making the best of what you have right now is critical to living. I do think that there's some kind of privilege in this book that I can't go ignoring. When we're talking about a bad life, Nora does experience that. Everyone experiences their own lows, and I can't say that one low is worse than another, but I can say that Nora's bad life isn't the worst possible life that she could be living. Yeah, she loses her job, but it doesn't look like she has financial pains. Yeah, she doesn't really have a forward goal in life, but she was able to get a degree from a university, and so there's certainly some pushback at just be happy with the life you live, because some people get dealt a bad hand of cards. Sometimes this solution isn't a solution for people. They don't have the means to be happy. They were systematically oppressed in some way. They were forced into the situation that they're in. These things can happen to people, and that's, I think, a different story. But I did want to address this idea that this isn't a catch-all theme for everyone. There are definitely different stories of struggle that this story doesn't encapsulate. But I do think that this is a pretty good philosophy to live by. This philosophy that the impact that you create by living matters. Even when you think it doesn't, the small ripples that you're creating will touch others for good if you try and do good. And that's important, and you should stay around to make as many ripples as you can to impact other people's lives. If you're out doing good for the community, working a soup kitchen, protesting, signing petitions, knocking doors for elections, or just holding the door open for someone, it all matters, at least on the immediate scale of human-to-human interaction. And I mean, we're like on this ball of rock and molten stuff, and we're hurtling through space at like 1 billion miles an hour, and there are way grander space cosmic events that could wipe us all out in a minuscule minute with no regard for how we live our lives. So how we impact one another is all that we can really care about, let's be honest. And I think that that point is really critical to this book, and Matt Haig is able to get that across very well, if sometimes maybe a little too bluntly for my taste. That's probably the biggest criticism I have, is that this isn't really a new look at this idea of living life. It's not a groundbreaking narrative, that's for sure. but I certainly connect with a lot of the emotions that Nora was experiencing throughout this whole book. And being able to create that connection for a reader is pivotal, especially when you're retelling an old story. The connection is what matters there. You can hear the same lesson 75 times. It might take until the 75th time for you to find that connection to actually internalize the lesson that's trying to be told to you. So those are the thematic elements that I think are done really well in this book. I also think that the writing itself is, for the most part, really well done. There's some solid, witty humor throughout it. The philosophy that Nora brings to the table when she's thinking or espousing to other characters, it never feels like an inflated ego trying to tell you how it is. It's her searching through philosophy to find answers, to find truth. Nora herself as a character is really enjoyable. While one might expect a character who is really listless and not knowing what they want to be not a really enjoyable character for a reader, I think she's inquisitive, observant, intelligent, and so following these trains of thought while also trying to play this fun game of what's going on in this life because she's just kind of plopped in is really enjoyable, and we get to explore her character through those moments. The structure of this book feels way more like an older style book, more like a bedtime story than a modern fiction book. Our character doesn't want something, she wants to want something, and one can see that as a flaw in this plot with no forward driving action. But I think that the exploration of lives is quick enough where we get the content and we don't hang around in that life for too long where it feels drawn out. And that, along with the shorter or at least more erratic chapter structure, actually picks up the pace in this book really well. And that's really critical when your character doesn't know what they want and is just kind of roaming around hoping for something to stumble into them. It's a very good counter to the lack of drive that Nora has. And I think also another good portion of that from a technical aspect is adding this kind of ticking time bomb idea with the library itself, where we don't know exactly when the library is going to cease to exist, but we get hints really early on in this book that it's going to, that she only has so much time to figure out what's going on here. That's where a lot of this tension comes in. That's where a lot of the driving force and forward momentum happens, is we know she has to keep going. Even if she doesn't know what she wants, we know she'll have to get there. Otherwise, this book is going to be pointless. This type of structure is super useful in a book like this. And I think Matt Haig did a really good job of noticing that and picking out those fixes for what might have been a pretty boring book otherwise, of Nora just going, oh, you know, like I kind of regret these things. I'm going to go figure them out. And so all of these things really made the book interesting and unique, even if the premise itself is fairly familiar. If I had a major issue with this book, without spoiling, it would probably be about 2/3 into this book, we're introduced to this concept, we're introduced to a character, and it's something that's just barely mentioned. It's something that they have a brief conversation about, and then it gets brought up a little bit later again, but it doesn't get explored fully. And it really feels like something that could have branched way more into the fantastical here. Something that we could have really delved into, and this book could have been way longer, and it would have been pretty interesting if that had gone somewhere. But it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't feel like we actually get an answer there. It just feels like it's like, whoop, there it is, and then left alone. And I don't like that we're left hanging there. But otherwise, I really enjoyed this book. I think Matt Haig definitely deserves a lot of the praise that he's been getting. I'll give this book 8 out of 9 cat lives. A quick read, only about like 90,000 words. It's roughly as long as 1984. I would definitely recommend it if you're into these life exploration books, these deeper philosophical books. I'm not saying this book is super deep and you gotta read this and it'll change your life, but I think it's really fun, and I think it does give you something to think about at least. And if this video gave you some things to think about, why don't you hit me with that like button? If you haven't yet, hit me with that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll catch you in the next one. And until then, stay lit.